Good afternoon, and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. With that, it is my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, which gets us a little bit on a different topic than our normal science topics. Dr. Becka McKay is a researcher and professor in the Department of English at Florida Atlantic University in the College of Arts and Letters, and she's a poet. She has published several books, one of which her first one is a book of poems, A Meteorologist in the Promised Land, that was published a little over 10 years ago. And she also has published a few translations. With that, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. McKay and have her tell us about her work.
Good afternoon. I want to first thank the Division of Research for kindly asking me to present. Sorry, one second. Technical difficulties. For asking me to present today. I saw just before my screen changed that there are like 60 of you out there, so thank you. I'm always heartened to learn that there are 60 people interested enough in poetry to take an hour out of their day for it. During the pandemic, I've been especially grateful for these research and action talks, which I have found both fascinating and personally inspirational, which I'm hoping I will show you evidence of later on. This talk is called Beginning with Language, the Pursuit of Poetry Expression. I've amended the title a little bit since the talk was first advertised, and I think you'll soon understand why. And the talk purports to be an examination of how and where I find the material for my poems. But I suspect that if you are watching me right now, you might be wondering how to pursue your own poetic expression. And if so, don't worry, you're in the right place. There's no magic to what I do. There's nothing I do in the pursuit of poetry that you can't do. So what I have to offer you today are my beliefs about poetry and its creation, its pursuit, in the hopes that my beliefs and your beliefs might overlap, and that as you hear me talk about how poems come into the world, we can enlarge that overlapping space and maybe all learn something. So in fact, I will show you that all poetry is just the result of two steps. Yes, two steps. The first is reading, and the second is writing. Is it really that easy? Well, of course not. And yet, every step of the process of making a poem involves one or the other of these two steps, usually both at the same time. So let's talk about reading first. This is a picture of all the books of poetry I've read so far this calendar year. And there they are with my dog for scale. I read a book of poetry. She's a 60-pound Labradoodle, so that should give you a sense of how big that stack is. I read a book of poetry every day, so this is about 80 books so far, because according to my calendar, today is the 84th day of the year. And I'm showing you this picture not to show off, except maybe to show off my dog, because she's cute, but to show you that when I say step one is read, I mean read. I don't just mean poetry, although those are all poetry books. I mean read everything: novels, newspapers, plays, biographies, histories, but most of all, read poetry. Because if we aren't hearing poetry regularly in our head and read out loud, we won't have the music for it, the rhythm of pentameter, for example, or the echoes of alliteration and assonance in our bodies. If we aren't witnessing on a regular basis the way lines break on a page, or noticing the spaces between stanzas, how can we create stanzas and lines of our own? But as you suspect, there's probably more to it than that. So I don't obviously keep my poetry books or any of my books outside. So to take this picture, I had to gather them all up and take them off of their shelves or wherever else I'd stacked them, because in the pandemic, I seemed to be running out of shelf space, and put them outside and make a pile of them. A pile which I will add did not want to stay upright for very long. And then I had to go grab a dog treat, because it was the only way to get my dog to give up the prime spot of sun and dirt she'd found in the yard and come over and pose for me. And meanwhile, it was pretty warm out already and I was sweating. Why am I telling you all of this? Because I believe the poetry must be embodied in order to do its work on us and for us to create it. And so I wanted a way to physically demonstrate the heft and the very weight of what I meant by read. So what do I mean by embodied? I mean carried physically in the body. When I write a poem, I read it out loud many times. And the act of reading begins with the breath in my lungs, with the vibration of my vocal cords, with the shaping of my mouth and tongue. And when I write a poem, I write it out many times by hand before I ever committed to the supposedly more permanent medium of my computer. And even when I have written some 10 or 12 of these handwritten drafts, and then I decide it's time to put it into a Word document and type it up and print it out, I then delete the document. Why do I do this? Because I believe that unless I am putting down each individual word on paper or typing it on the screen, I will lose my awareness of that word's importance in the poem. And in a poem, every single word matters. Poetry is, as the poet Rita Dove said, language distilled down to its very essence. To make a poem that reflects what is essential in that way, I need to be certain that every word in the poem is the right word in the right place, nothing more and nothing less. As the poet Ross Gay told my creative writing students last year, whatever way is the slowest way for you to write, do that. A third way that poetry is embodied, which I will talk about a bit more when I get to step 2, is that it's meant to engage the senses. When you write poetry, you use imagery that you can feel, touch, taste, hear, and smell. I think that's all 5. It engages the senses. So what you'll notice, or what you've noticed by now, is that I can't really talk about reading poetry without talking about writing poetry. And that is not accidental. The 2 steps are not necessarily sequential, but rather they represent a kind of exchange that takes place between all poets. Poetry is a conversation. It is a conversation between the poet and the reader, between the poet and the world, and between the poems themselves. I read all of this poetry, these books, every single day because I want to know what other poets are saying and how they are saying it. I want to know what's important to them because it helps me understand what's important to me. I want to see the forms they're working in so that I can try them out and then invent forms of my own. I read all of this poetry because poetry is not a passive form of communication, and reading poetry is not a passive form of reading. Poetry should be a verb to the poet. Poetry is active reading. Let me say that again. Poetry is active reading. It might be the most important thing I say today because the supposed difficulty, and I put that in quotes, of poetry is what gives so many people anxiety when they're asked to read a poem. It's why people say they don't get poetry. But because I believe poetry is a verb, when we read poetry, we actively engage with it on the page. A poem is kind of like a dance partner. When you're dancing, you don't ask your partner to interpret your steps, and you don't interpret theirs, which is not to say that dancing has no meaning. What I'm saying is that poetry is an active art form, just like dancing. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of technical issues. Okay. So when you read a poem, you become a part of it, if only for that moment when its language is moving through you. There's a paradox here that may be the second most important thing I say today. Reading poetry requires us to slow down. Because everything I've said about poetry so far, the way it demands your participation, your body, your voice, it requires space and stillness. And in that space and stillness, slowness. I don't believe we can read a poem at the same speed we tend to do everything else. And we do everything else pretty quickly these days. To read a poem, I have to tell my brain to slow down. So I'm going to read a poem now by the poet Mark Doty. It's called Difference. The jellyfish float in the bay shallows like schools of clouds. A dozen identical, is it right to call them creatures, these elaborate sacks of nothing? All they seem is shape and shifting. And though a whole troop of undulant cousins go about their business within a single wave span, everyone does something unlike. This one, a balloon open on both ends, but swollen to its full expanse. This one, a breathing heart. This, a pulsing flower. This one, a rolled condom or a plastic purse. Sorry, I have to move this there. Or a plastic purse swallowing itself. That one, a Tiffany shade. This, a troubled parasol. This submarine opera's all subterfuge and disguise. Its plot a fabulous tangle of hiding and recognition. Nothing but trope. Nothing but something forming itself into figures, then refiguring. Sheer ectoplasm recognizable only as the stuff of metaphor. What can words do but link what we don't know, but link what we know to what we don't, and so form a shape, which shrinks or swells, configures or collapses, blooms even as it is described into some unlikely marine chiffon. A gown for Isadora? Nothing but style. What binds one shape to another also sets them apart. But what's lovelier than the shape-shifting transparence of like and as, clear, undulant words? We look at alien grace, unfettered by any determined form, and we say balloon, flower, heart, condom, opera, lampshade, parasol, ballet, so full of longing for the world, changes its shape. So I've read that poem dozens, if not hundreds of times by now. And every time I read it, I'm astonished by the transformation, by the many transformations actually, that take place between the beginning and the end of the poem. We start out by looking at jellyfish, an animal that is both ordinary in its ubiquity and extraordinary in its ability to shapeshift. And through the poet's remarkable language, which manages to be both straightforward and incredibly lyrical and descriptive, we can see those jellyfish moving through the water. Sometimes when I read this poem, I can even hear the sounds of that water and sense the way the movement of the ocean is part of the movement of the jellyfish. The plastic purse swallowing itself, the breathing heart. These are not new objects to us. And yet the poet, by putting the images in the order he puts them in, by breaking his lines carefully to give the poem plenty of space for breathing and movement, makes them new for the reader. He asks us to slow down enough to see what he's really talking about and thereby see them, these objects, in an unfamiliar way. And then the twist. He's not talking about jellyfish at all. Or he is, but he's using the jellyfish as metaphors for his real subject, which is language itself. He writes, what's lovelier than the shape-shifting transparence of like and as, clear, undulant words? Language is the jellyfish, and the ability of language to shape itself into metaphor and simile. For the poet to be able to say, the jellyfish is like a rolled up condom, the jellyfish is a Tiffany lamp, is as miraculous as these strange prehistoric creatures that still live in our oceans. That is what language can do, and that is what poetry can do. I believe that by slowing down when we read poetry, slowing down enough to absorb the poem's images, to hear the poem's music, we allow that miracle to happen. I could spend a lot of time talking about this poem, and I have, because I teach it in my introduction to creative writing classes all the time. But I think this is a good time to move on to step 2 of our 2-step process of writing poetry. Oops, right. So I'm going to share one of my poems with you. I wrote this poem about a year and a half ago, and it was published by the Bullet Poetry Journal and then republished on Verse Daily. Elegy begun in July. 1. Come back, says my father, to the ruby-throated hummingbird, studying the dahlias on the deck where we drink our coffee. In the house, his wife says something to her hospice nurse that makes them both laugh. This moment has little market value until you add up the cost of red nectar and dahlias my father bought to battle the reluctance of hummingbirds. Come back. His voice pebbles with exasperation. The grammar of his grief is full of false imperatives. 2. The dying have fewer rules than the dead, breath anchoring in their chests as the rest of the body grows lonely for oxygen, like landscapes grow lonely for shadows on overcast days. The dying have sharper eyes than I expected, gaze of circling hawks, all hunger without burden of intellect. 3. Lucid means clear, as if the dying are less transparent, and maybe they are. Maybe when we forget ourselves, our bodies fill with clouds. What I mean to say is I'm afraid of the dying, who might say anything at all, though not of the dead. I will sit with the body whenever I'm needed, but if the dying want to talk, I'm mute as the row of boulders my father planted under the hackberries, a spine to keep the weeds in place. So you might be surprised to learn that when I started to write this poem, I didn't sit down to write about my stepmother's death. This poem is called an elegy, or about my father's frustration with his wife's very long and painful struggle with brain cancer, as replicated by his frustration with getting more hummingbirds to come to the feeder he'd set up to lure them. Nor did I sit down to write about death and dying, or my somewhat fraught relationship with my stepmother, though all of these things, I think, clearly make up the larger themes and images of the poem. The first thing in this poem that I really thought about was those last 2 stanzas, the boulders, the hackberry trees, and the weeds. The spine to keep the weeds in place, those were probably the first words of this poem that ever showed up on paper. So let me go back a few steps and talk about my general writing process. Every morning, I get up very early and I free write based on a prompt. And each year I give myself a new set of prompts. One year, I got the best gift from one of my former students, which was a daily calendar of forgotten words. Every morning, my free write was based on a different, strange, and forgotten word. Last year, I had a similar daily calendar, but it was all birds of North America. So you will see a lot of birds if you spend much time reading my work. And one year, which actually turned into almost 2 years, I worked from a book called The 613, which I'm showing you here because it's an amazing book, in which the artist Archie Rand made one painting for each of the 613 biblical commandments. So I wrote one page for every one of those commandments, which resulted in a 206-page, 142,000 word document at the end of 613 days. If you are unfamiliar with the idea of free writing, which is also sometimes called unconscious writing or automatic writing, I'll explain. The idea is to sit down with or without a prompt and simply write without thinking about what you're writing and without stopping. The hope is to generate language that comes straight from the unconscious, unmediated by inspiration or the desire to write about something in a particular form or format. This daily generated language is always where I begin my poems. After each morning's free write, I type up the previous morning's free write on my computer. I do this partly because I have terrible handwriting and I need to decipher my own words pretty soon after I write them, and partly because I like to have a record of the free writing in a couple of places. So why do my poems begin almost exclusively from this generated language? I believe that the freshest, most original language comes from the most unexpected places. And therefore, like many poets, I have to find ways of tricking myself into finding those unexpected juxtapositions of language. I believe in the poetry of the aleatory, which is just another way to say by chance. So some of you may have heard of the Oulipo poets. That stands for the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, or Workshop of Potential Literature, which is a group of French poets, or they started out as French. I think they're international now. And they write poetry that comes from artificial constraints. So, for example, one of their most famous techniques is the N+7 poem, in which they take a poem, one they've written or even someone else's poem, and they substitute every noun in the poem with the word that comes 7 words after it in the dictionary. So the word snow might become the word soap, or winter might become wisdom. To give you an example of an aleatory technique a little closer to home, I found this poem that I wrote some years ago. Every year, the O Miami Poetry Festival invites people to submit zip odes, in which the rules of the ode are dictated by the numbers in your zip code. So the number of words in each line of these 5-line poems corresponds with the poet's zip code. So here's the ode that I wrote when I lived in the 33444 zip code. I wouldn't call Delray Beach paradise, but when mom calls complaining about winter, I call it close enough. Which my mother actually hated that. She thought it meant that I didn't want her to come down here for winter. That's not really what I meant at all. So I learned many of these aleatory techniques from the poet Carolyn Forche, who taught a workshop that I took almost 30 years ago. She told us a story about how she came to use so many different methods of generating language, and I've always found it a helpful story, so I'm going to tell it to you. She was living with a painter at a time in her life when she was finding it very difficult to write after the publication of her second book of poems. She admired the way that the painter could work with his materials even if he wasn't feeling inspired to paint. He could stretch and prime canvas, he could mix colors, do figure studies or other kinds of preparation. And so Carolyn invented her own set of exercises that felt to her like a kind of priming of the canvas. And she used those techniques to write her third book of poems, The Angel of History. In the workshop, she gave us a packet of exercises and reading material that I still have. And one of the suggestions she gave us was to sit down at the same time and in the same place every morning and free write. Why the same place and the same time? She said it was so the muse would know where to find us. And I think she was right. Not that there is a literal muse out there looking down and waiting to reward the writer with inspiration. But I do believe that after years of practicing these techniques, that if you attend to your work in a committed way, in a way that asks you to be accountable to yourself, in other words, if you set out to create an actual writing practice, you are much more likely to produce something you feel proud of and want to share with the world. So let's go back for a minute to my poem and those last 5 lines that I said were actually where the poem began. That image, a row of boulders laid out in an effort to keep weeds from their inevitable forward march into a garden, is real, or a real image. Those boulders exist, but they are probably more like large rocks than boulders. But my father had nothing to do with them. My father lives on the 5th floor of a 6-story building and has no yard and no weeds and no hackberry trees, though he does have a hummingbird feeder on his balcony. And he really did yell at a hummingbird to come back while I was sitting out there with him drinking coffee, and his wife was with her hospice nurse inside. But those boulders were actually laid out behind my mother's house in Minnesota, where I spend every summer and where I sit down early every morning and free write at my desk there. A desk that happens to look out on a large grass-covered area that is bordered by very tall and imposing hackberry trees on its western edge. 2 summers ago, over the course of several weeks, one of my mother's neighbors patiently dragged dozens of very large rocks and lined them up in front of those hackberry trees, so that each morning as the sun came up, I witnessed those rocks multiplying, the line growing. Though the neighbor never worked on this project while I was writing, so the rocks seemed to be assembling on their own. And over the course of that summer, they appeared more than once in my free writing, as did eventually my dying stepmother, my grieving father, and those hummingbirds. And eventually, over the course of 10 or 12 or 15 or maybe 20 drafts, each of those pieces fit together, puzzle-like, to form that poem. In the first 5 or 10 drafts, I kept the neighbor, whose name I don't even know, in the poem. I gave him ownership of his labors. So the poem made several shifts, from my father and I drinking coffee to the part about sitting with the dying and the dead, and yet to another locale, the yard where my neighbor was building the rock wall. But the thing about poetry that you might not know that I'm going to tell you now is that it doesn't have to be honest to be true. In other words, you can change the facts to tell the truth. I don't know whether this information will scandalize you or if it will give you comfort, but it was a very useful solution for me to realize that I could keep the lens of the poem focused on my father and let those rocks be a physical, tangible metaphor for the labor of his grieving. I want to show you a couple of more examples of poems that come from my daily free writes. The first one I'm going to read is from a new book that I wrote of poems that's coming out in May. It's called The Little Book of No Consolation. And as you can see, this poem was influenced by the Forgotten Words calendar. It's called Inhabitiveness, the desire to remain in one place. The lost art of God's failure to erase each ridge and bump from your skull was given to us by Franz Gall, father of phrenology, a method invented to codify God's errors, a bump for adventurers and a bump for homebodies, a bump for the vicious and a bump for the kind. Before you were born, God wrapped his hands around your head, a gift you won't remember, held by the wisdom of everything. You were small, but the womb grew smaller, and you wriggled from his fingers. The field of hillock and furrow that remained in the shape of God's grip is not, as Gall believed, a map of human disposition or a way to predict criminality, a bump for kicking dogs, a bump for nurturing grudges, but an atlas of every room you'll enter before you die, and how the light inside will embrace the dust, and who will be there to greet you. The story of every threshold you will cross before you return to the cradle of God's palms, before he smooths your skull for good. So that poem came from the day that inhabitiveness, that word that is no longer in wide usage, was the daily word, and then the little story that the calendar told using that word was about Franz Gall, who was the father of phrenology, which was that discredited science of the bumps on our heads. So this poem is based on one of those paintings that came from the 613 Commandments. This comes from, I can't remember which number commandment this is, but the commandment itself is do not eat maggots, as you can see in the epigraph. Leviticus as campaign rally in midsummer. Finally, a commandment I can follow. Although who's to say disaster won't name me to a list of sorry survivors, leaving hunger and sin together on my tongue? Who's to say I won't end up eating maggots beside a banked fire, asked to bear witness to the failed world while the loons sweep their path down dawn's burning back? Centuries ago, loons were the loudest singers in the sky, the truest throat of warning. Now bad news is the din curving close, planet-shaped. As with any shadow imposed on any sphere, One edge of danger always appears nearer than the rest. Call this stretch of shadow 13 seconds of silence. Call it go back to where they came from. Name the shadow's reach for anything on fire. When I began to write these words, I meant to say, no problem, I won't eat maggots. And in this small refusal, I'd remain committed to an ongoing lack of apocalypse. But I'm not the same person who said, don't give disaster a reason to bring you along for the ride. I know now there is no one I will not stand with against the dark. Once I admired goldfinches for their roller coaster flights, convinced they moved this way for joy alone. I see one now, small bright fist punching waves into the sky, and I think, escape. So that poem I wrote obviously after one of Trump's campaign rallies, the one where he was talking about Representative, for example, Representative Omar, and telling her or listening to the audience shout, "Go back to where they came from," and he didn't respond for 13 seconds, and that was his response. And I felt like that merited noting, that merited not being forgotten. And yet the poem it began from this idea of there being a commandment not to eat maggots. So I hope that you can see through these two poems that while my poems begin with language, they keep going from there. By which I mean that no matter what I use to prompt myself to write, no matter which techniques of chance or artificial constraints I use, my daily concerns and experiences, whatever I'm thinking about, obsessing about, always shows up in the poems. The poet Ross Gay told us, honor your obsessions, and I believe that. We write what we need to write. That part might not be entirely up to us. But what is up to us as poets and writers is how we choose to write our obsessions and how we can make the ever-present feel fresh and original. I gave my students a revision exercise last night, and we talked about it for a long time, and I think it's a useful enough exercise to share with you, to give you a further sense of how all poets are grappling with their own language and how personal that language is and how personal the nature of our own vocabularies is and how that personal nature is key to our own poetry. So for this exercise, you can take any poem. I use this as an exercise for revision, so I use a poem I'm already working on. But if you want this to be a generative exercise, you could use anybody's poem at all. And you rewrite it by using the opposite of every word. So a line like, do not go gentle into that good night, old age should burn and rave at close of day, obviously from Dylan Thomas, could be written as, do stay rough out of this terrible day. New youth shouldn't drown or sing at opening of night. Or, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, which is from Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, could be rendered as, your master's ears aren't anything hating the moon. So this might seem like a silly endeavor that results in some nonsense, but it's that nonsense, those strange juxtapositions of language, where I think poetry begins. I also recommend this exercise because it can really help any writer to learn more about their own vocabulary and to push on that vocabulary. What is the opposite of burn or rave or Leviticus for that matter? If I asked everyone out there to write the opposite of Sonnet 1, we would get as many versions as there are people in the audience. So I want to show you a final technique that that is new to me because I just invented it. I didn't invent the cento. That is an old form. There's evidence that both Homer and Virgil created centos. Centos, the word cento comes from the Latin word for patchwork. And a cento is a poem that is composed entirely from lines of other poems. So what I call A wolf cento, or a substitute cento, is a cento in which all the borrowed lines contain some version of the same common word, such as river or moon or God. And then the poet substitutes another word for that word. So I use the word wolf, hence wolf centos. So here's an example of one of my wolf centos. So that's what I just explained. Okay. So all the words in this poem that are wolf were originally the word river, and this poem is based on lines from about 10 other poets. Wolf Cento 1. A wolf by nature overflows its terms. Tell me how the wolf didn't take us under. I always give the wolf back to itself. Someone must be a wolf that can type. Show us up to our waist in grass and wolves, rushes. A wolf always, in one way or another, says go. Wolves explain themselves. The riled heat reaches the wolf before it reaches the dark. The wolf was opening and closing its stone lips. Call again at your convenience to say how wet wolves smell where you live. We should guide each other to the ends of our days, like tugboats dodging bad barges, misplaced midway down a wolf. So I said that. So I have 3 of those, and I when I say that I read a book of poetry every day, one of the things I do is I write down a lot of lines from those books, and so it seemed like a useful way to make to do something with all of that language that I was borrowing or stealing from other poets. So I said when I began this talk that I had found research in action in the past talks personally inspirational. And so, of course, what I meant is that after watching one talk in particular by Dr. Rindy Anderson about birdsong, I wrote a poem. The talk was called Why Birds Sing, Why It Matters, and I highly recommend that you watch it. But Dr. Anderson spoke about what birdsong means and why animals communicate in general and in specific. And I found her research really fascinating. So this poem that I'm gonna sort of end by reading this poem because it's a little bit long. Is a fairly new poem, and you'll see that it starts out by being about the birdsong, but it kind of goes in a lot of other directions. So it's a pandemic poem. Were we victims of birdsong when the pandemic began? Frantic music at our windows? No, the scientists assured us, safer behind their screens. This is normal birdsong. We forgot we make so much noise. The Pope has only one lung. Where is the other lung buried? Not for pilgrimage, but someone must keep track. 3 lungs between 2 popes is funny math. The white-crowned sparrow sings one song all his life. Bachman's sparrow sings as many as 48. I misplaced my breath near the Vatican gardens, hearing the story of another pope. He was nobody's prisoner. He was called holy for his excavations. He was called hateful. He knew how many bones it takes to cage a victory. Before birdsong comes subsong, avian equivalent of a baby's babble, like humming before knowing the words. The Inquisition lasted 356 years, as though futility, not cruelty, finally gave church fathers pause. 8 kinds of animal are vocal learners, teaching their young the language of the species. Elephants, bats, seals, hummingbirds, humans, parrots, songbirds, whales and their kin. In Assisi, I saw a saint's jawbone housed in glass and silver, a little battered on the faded satin. Bachman's sparrow whispers warnings to its tribe rather than larger alarms. Whisper song is meant to foil eavesdropping predators and rivals. Unless she had a seal's feet and a man's arms, Birgitta, patron saint of Sweden, lost all of her bones. In Stockholm, you might find what the pardoner sold as St. Birgitta in a museum instead of a church, as though holiness in time hardens to history. To learn how many songs Bachman's sparrow knows, scientists use a decoy to simulate territorial intrusion. The decoy sang, the sparrows matched and countered. The scientists counted. A hawk flew past, and the sparrows started to whisper. In 1654, 300 years after Brigida's bones disappeared between Rome and Sweden, Queen Christina abdicated her throne, scandalizing the Swedes by converting to Catholicism. She moved to Rome and asked the Pope to end the custom of running the Jews through the streets at Carnival. The word sparrow makes a smallness in the mind. How many sparrows does it take to survive a pandemic? If I say God walked away, I'm afraid he'll take my tongue. So that is the end. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions about that poem. It's pretty new, so that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. McKay, please write them under the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse there, you see a Q&A icon come up. If you click on that, a little pop-up comes up and you can type your questions. We're going to go through as many questions as we can during our time here. All right. Becca, if you have published your poems, what kind of advice do you have for anyone who is a writer and would like to get their poems published? How do you go about that?
I have so much advice. I mean, actually, I had a whole part of this talk that was about that. And I have this word at the end, if there was going to be time to talk about it, about the actual third step of writing poetry, because after reading and writing, the third step is persisting, because it takes a long time to get published, and it means dealing with a lot of rejection. But there are many, many magazines out there that publish poetry, and I can post resources for anybody that's interested, because there are really magazines that are publishing just about every kind of poetry these days. So you work on your poem until you are satisfied that you cannot do anything else with it, and then you send it out. So I always say that my poems should always be working, right? Either I'm working on them, or I've sent them to my friends from grad school who 20 years on are still the first readers of my work, and then I'm revising them, and then I'm sending them out to be published. And so the poem is always in some mode, I guess, of that process. And then when you feel like you have enough poems to make a book, then there's the whole process of sitting down with your poems and figuring out the order that the book goes in and how you want the poems to speak to each other. For me, this step usually involves spreading them out all on the floor and sort of moving them or putting them on my home office here. But it is a long process, and for the first few years that I was sending out poems, I would be excited. And this was like back in this was before you could do everything electronically. So you would go to the post office with your packet of poems that you were sending to different publishers, and then you'd send your little self-addressed stamped envelope, and if you got it in those early days, if I got it back with a personalized rejection, a kind rejection where they said what they liked and why that I would put that on the refrigerator. That was really exciting for me. So it's a long process. You don't have to publish your poems to be a poet. But it is a pretty great way of continuing that conversation that I was
Sure.
talking about.
Sure. You talked about aleatory poetry, and the question here is, what are some other poems or poets that utilize this form of poetry?
Mm. Um, so besides the Ulipo poets, one of my favorite forms of aleatory poetry is, I like this especially because I'm also a translator of poetry. It's called homophonic translation, where you take a poem that's written in a language you don't know and you translate it by sound. So Louis Zukowski did this. He and his wife Celia very famously translated the Latin poet Catullus this way, and got these very interesting sounding poems that they both were and weren't translations, but sound was really the what guided them in creating those poems. I have a whole book. There's a book called Reft and Light by the poet Ernst Jandl, who's a German poet, um, and he very much writes based on German, on language. So his poems seem very difficult to translate, and so a lot of poets got together and they created this book of translations that are really kind of also aleatory exercises. So that those are ones I can think of right now, but there are a lot of other techniques. Like if you go to the Poetry Foundation website, they have that's a very good resource for what other poets are doing.
Excellent, great, thank you. Coming back to your own poems, one of the questions here is, how do you decide on the format for your poems, like couplets, tercets, etc.? Do your poems change form as you work on a draft after draft, or do you stick with one form?
Oh no, they change. I start out, I start out by, so example, I'm working on this poem right now. You can see all this is, I think, maybe the fourth draft, right? You can see all of the lines and the notes I make myself. And then I'm always, I like to have 10 beat, not 10 beat, but 5 beat lines or 10 syllable lines. Not for any other real reason except that it helps me to create the lines, right? Sometimes I'll break those in half, like the pandemic poem had short lines because I wanted to make a poem with short lines. Um, but yeah, all those things change, and they just a, a stanza, and the space in between it. It's sort of a matter of what I want the rhythm of the poem to be, whether I want it to read quickly or for there to be a lot of gaps for breathing. And so those things sort of get resolved as I write the different drafts.
Great, thank you. Also related to your own poems, how long does it typically take you to write a poem? You showed us your fourth draft there. How long do you think it'll take you until you call your poem done?
Uh, that's such a good question. I mean, once I left graduate school, once I graduated in 1998, I went from writing a whole bunch of poems at once, which is kind of what you have to do during grad school, to realizing that it was better for me to just work on one poem at a time. And so, um, and every poem takes a different amount of time. I mean, I've been working on this poem for maybe a week now, and it still feels pretty far away. So maybe to get that first draft, by the time I get the first draft to my friend Brenda or my friend Erin, my first readers, maybe it would take me 3 weeks, but then they would send it back with changes. And then in some ways I sort of start again. So, but then sometimes they just come out, sometimes not very often, but so I mean, it can take weeks. It can take weeks. I wouldn't say it takes months, but maybe it does.
Great. Um, you spoke about your school work and your degree. One of the questions that one of our attendees here has is related to going to school for poetry. So she's asking about your opinion on a master's in fine arts versus other post undergraduate degrees that you can pursue for writers of poetry.
Hmm. Well, I am the director of an MFA program, so it would be strange for me to say anything, but they can work. But I also think, like, honestly, we get lots of applications to our MFA program every year, and so I know there are a lot of people out there that want the degree. And what I say to people when I am trying to when I'm giving them advice, because obviously as a director of a creative writing program, people come to me asking advice, is I say, if you feel like your writing has gotten to the point where you just where you want a community of people who are also at this sort of space in their lives, who want to take the time, and you want that kind of community, and you want to learn how to maybe teach creative writing, and you really feel like you've done everything you can do without the degree, then maybe you should go get an MFA. But it's not a required degree to be a poet. It is a required degree technically to teach creative writing at the university level, but those jobs are really hard to get right now. And so I can't, when our new students come in, the first thing I say to them is, it is going to be really hard for you to get a job like mine. I don't want to delude you about that. And so there are other paths to go. I mean, I didn't go straight from getting an MFA to teaching creative writing. I got my MFA. I worked at Microsoft for a while as an editor. Then I went back to grad school because I was still really interested in translation, and so I got another MFA in translation. And again, I'm not saying you need two MFAs to be a writer or a translator. And then I stayed at the University of Iowa and I got a PhD. And so I stayed in school because it seemed to be the right thing to do for my writing and for my translation. Um, but that was, it wasn't until after that, until I was done with my PhD, that this job happened to come along. And so in a way it was also just luck and circumstance that the job was ready when I was ready. But yeah, you don't need any of that to be a poet. You just need to read a lot. You need to read your 80 books by the 80th day of the year, and you need to develop a practice so that you are accountable to yourself for writing every day, and that, I think, is all you actually need to be a poet. And MFA offers a lot of other things, a lot of kind of perks in terms of learning to be a literary citizen, and learning to teach creative writing, and finding your lifelong readers. That's really important. I still show my work first to people I was in school with, more than 20 years ago. Um, but it's not the only way.
Great. We're almost out of time. I'm going to leave you with one more question. I know we have more questions left. So, Becca, we're going to ask you to answer the remaining questions offline, and we'll
I'll be
post them
happy to,
together
yeah.
with we'll post them together with a recording of the
Okay.
presentation on our website. The last question is very timely, I think, given that Amanda Gorman, recited her poem during the inauguration. Would you like to see poetry get wider recognition? And if so, how do you think that could happen?
It's funny because this question comes up a lot, and I figured I knew somebody would ask about Amanda Gorman, and I loved Amanda Gorman's poem, and I love the voice that she has, and it's amazing that she's so young and she has already such a distinct voice. But I also think that poetry kind of is out there. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years. It hasn't gone anywhere. It would be great if all the presidents had an inaugural poet, but not that many of them have done so. But there are, I mean, poetry. If you live anywhere near Miami, you'll see in April, Oh Miami puts poetry. Their goal of that festival is to put a poem in the hand of everyone in Miami during the 30 days of April. And so, um, I think poetry is actually better represented than people realize. It is in a lot of places. Um, my students and I were talking last night about how, there's not a lot of money in it. And so it doesn't get a huge
Mhm.
profile, right? But it's there. It's,
Yeah, good,
everybody has their favorite poems, right?
great. All right, thank you very much, Becca. As I said, we will answer the remaining questions offline and post the answers on our website. There will be a recording of this presentation that it will be available in a couple of days also on our website. That is Florida Atlantic University Division of Research, Research in Action. With that, thank you very much, Becca. Very, very interesting. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We hope to see you next week. Have a great day. Bye-bye.